I sat down with my family to watch The House of David, and within the first few minutes, I started getting bombarded with questions from my kids. Like, what is going on with David's mother? Is Goliath really that tall? Why is it that David keeps talking about giants? And is this stuff actually in the Bible, Dad? And it kind of dawned on me that if my kids were asking these kinds of questions, some of you may be wondering, as you're watching The House of David, how much of this is fact, it's biblical, how much of it is speculative, and how much of this is just fictitious. And so I wanted to do a limited series that will walk through the various episodes of the show that is kind of like a running commentary with a theologian that unpacks the biblical facts, the things that are speculative. They're rooted in some type of biblical idea, but it's speculating beyond what the Bible gives us. And then just honestly, some fictitious stuff, but it's probably really fun. And so I want to start with just how to think about the House of David. If you are trying to find a show and you want to be like 100% faithful to the biblical text, here's my encouragement for you. Don't watch the show. That's not the intent of the show. The intent of the show is to give us insight into the life and into the background and into the emotion, the story of what's taking place with David and with the people of Israel. And so I think it's important that we evaluate the show on the terms that the producers are trying to communicate to us, and we don't get caught up or caught off guard with things that are intentionally speculative or maybe even intentionally fictitious in order to help us get into a different type of part of the story to cause emotion in our hearts so that we can really get deeper into the biblical text. And so that's why part of what I'm going to do is try to parse out with wisdom and discernment what is biblical fact, what is speculative, things that are rooted in the Bible but move beyond what we can know that the Bible actually tells us, and then just the fictitious thing. The opening scene is pretty epic. You've got David who jumps onto the field and he's about to fight Goliath, and that's when you see this monstrous being. And so you probably have some questions like, were giants even in the Bible? And if they were they actually that tall? But David says a little line that is the first thing that caught me. And in that line, I'm just going to summarize what he says. He says, Lord, give me this land. And what actually happens here is what I think is the key to understanding the narrative structure of the entire Old Testament, and specifically what's happening with David and Goliath and Saul and the Philistines. What David enters into in that moment is what I like to refer to as a cosmic, geographical, territorial war. Now, what do I mean by that? If you look back at Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9, which takes place as the aftermath of the story of the Tower of Babel, all the nations gather together. They try to build this ziggurat temple tower. In so doing, God comes down and he punishes them. He takes away the one language that they all knew that knit them together. And instead they are separated into tribal, national, people groups that have their own languages. Now, Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9, as you read it with the Dead Sea Scrolls, as affirmed by the Septuagint, the Hebrew Bible translated into Greek, the phrase Bene Elohim, the sons of God, should be understood as divine beings. So what God does is he takes a group of his divine council, angelic beings, and he grants them stewardship over the nations, not so that they would be gods of the nations, but they would steward them. They would guard and protect these nations until the appropriate time where God would actually step in and reclaim the nations as his inheritance. Now, what these divine beings do is they go into total rebellion. Deuteronomy 4:19 kind of unpacks this, that they elicit the worship of the nations. And in so doing, they actually become the gods of the nations. This is the backdrop for the entire Old Testament. This is why God actually gives us the 10 plagues to Egypt. It's not just war on Egypt, it's war on the gods of Egypt. And to call them gods, the Hebrew term is Elohim. It's a classification that lets us know that these are spiritual beings. It's the technical way that you would understand the Hebrew term Elohim. Now, God is Elohim. God is God, but no other Elohim is God, as my late great doctoral advisor, Dr. Michael Heiser, often said, that the God is Elohim, but no other Elohim can be God. So in a sense, Yahweh is species unique. Now, why is this all important? Because these gods of the nations have geographical land and territory, and they're trying to keep it for themselves. And yet what Yahweh does through Abraham, through the Joshua conquest, which David actually hints on quite a bit in the show, and ultimately through David, is he's in the process of reclaiming this turf back for himself, because it rightly belongs to him. And so what ends up happening is David is on that turf and he's saying, God, this is your turf anyways. This is both geography, earthly land, but there's also a cosmic implication as well to this. Now, I think there's a story that we need to unpack in order to really grasp this. And the story is found in 1 Samuel 5:2. It's the story of Dagon, who was the Philistine god, the Ark of the Covenant, and an insane scene of humiliation that takes place. I've got an infographic that, or not an infographic, but just an image that I think depicts this really well. Dagon was the Philistine god, and when the Philistines actually captured the Ark of the Covenant, 1 Samuel 5:2, in chapter 5, you can read all about this. The Philistines are like, we're going to take the Ark of the Covenant and put it in the house of Dagon, our god, and this is going to be amazing. And yet what ends up happening consistently? Well, Dagon every morning falls face down in front of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, I think this is really important. Dagon was a deity that had regional authority in the southern Mesopotamian area. 1 Samuel 5:2 says this: "So the Israelites took the ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon and set it up beside Dagon." And then it continues in verse 3. "And when the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon, put him back in his place. But when they rose early on the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen face down on the ground before the ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon and both his hands were lying cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him." Now, there's some etymological things about Dagon, and modern scholarship now has kind of disproved that the etymology actually has to do with Dagon being a fish deity, because the etymology of Dagon in Hebrew, it can actually lend to like a fish as a symbol or an image. Now, even though that modern scholarship has kind of proven that, and I agree with it, I still think there's something kind of hilarious about this, that if there was some type of connection, that you have Dagon falling face down in front of the Ark of the Covenant, in front of God, and as he does so, hands, feet, everything, it looks like a fish drowning on the ground, or like, dying on the ground in front of the Ark of the Covenant. And so this is an example of God taking turf, taking even the house of Dagon and making it his own, because all the other gods of the nations cannot hold up or stand up to God himself. David would have probably been well aware of this story. David grew up with the story of Yahweh, and he's well aware that his God is superior to all the other gods. And it's kind of weird for David. He's like, why is everybody panicking? Why are they all freaking out? Don't they know who Yahweh is? And so this sets the scene for why David kind of goes and deals with it. Okay, here's the other really big question. Why does David consistently seem to talk about giants? Where do these giants come from? And does Joshua actually talk about giants in the book of Joshua? Now, there are a couple terms that we really need to understand here that's going to actually help you with this. The giant clans actually come from the Nephilim of Genesis 6. And the text explicitly says in Genesis 6 that the Nephilim were on the earth before the flood and also afterward. Now, how they could be there is a debated kind of situation. All we're told is that they were there. So the phrase that they were there after, it actually looks forward to Numbers 13:33. Let me just give you two of the reasons of how they could have been there afterwards. I don't have enough time to jump into the details of this. Maybe I'll do a separate video one day. But one of the theories is that the flood was a localized flood and not a global flood. The Hebrew phrase koleretz, which means the whole earth, could be read and understood as the biblical author talking about the land that he was aware of, the whole earth that he was aware of. And so it was a localized flood, which means that there were places that the Nephilim had spread out into that were not dealt with the flood. The other option is that the same issue that took place in Genesis 6 at some point after the flood took place again. And so that's another option. My view is a hybrid between the two. Actually, it's a rejection of the second one. It's just a hybrid of the first one, where it's not a localized flood, but it's a globalized local flood. That the flood took place in all kinds of areas, and yet there were pockets of places that were not destroyed by the flood. Koleretz, that Hebrew phrase, it kind of alludes to that it was what was known to the biblical author. And maybe those were the places where some of these Nephilim still lived. So in Numbers 13:3, 3, it actually says with pretty good clarity that the descendants of the Nephilim are the those that come from the tribe of Anak, or the Anakim. And these people were oversized. They were giants. The sons of Anak, the Anakim, were one of the giant clans described in the conquest narratives. You can look at Deuteronomy chapter 2, 10 through 11, Joshua chapter 11, 21 through 22, and the text clearly links these beings to the Nephilim. But how is this possible given the account of the flood? Well, I just talked about those two ways that we can account for their presence even after the flood. This takes us to Joshua. What is Joshua doing in the conquest? The strategy for Joshua in the conquest, when he's reclaiming Canaan, is to deal with the Nephilim. The flood was intended to deal with the Nephilim. Well, the flood, after the flood, some of these descendants are still around. So what does Joshua do? Joshua picks locations where there are known descendants of the Nephilim, the Anakim, and the similar term is Rephaim, that these giants are still around. So you find this in Joshua 10, 28 through 43, that the strategy that Joshua deploys is dependent on the location of these Anakim and where they were known to live. We could read Joshua 11, 21 through 22. At that time, Joshua proceeded to, 11, 21 through 20. Yeah. At that time, Joshua proceeded to exterminate the Anakim from the hill country, Hebron, Debir, Ahab, and all the hill country of Judah and Israel. Joshua completely destroyed them with their cities. No Anakim were left in the land of the Israelites, except for some remaining in, very important detail, Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Why add this note of Gath? Why add Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod? Well, because these are Philistine cities. One needs only to recall the Goliath of Gath, and his brothers are located in this place. So Goliath is a descendant of the Anakim, and there's a problem here because these giants are still around. Now that we identify that these beings are Anakim or descendants of the Nephilim, how do we make sense of their size? How big are they? Now, I think we need to be careful here to note the difference between what is found within the biblical text and that which is exaggerated. So often online or through other kind of media outlets, you get this kind of senseless, sensationalized view of these massive giants. How tall were these giants? Goliath is an excellent case study for this. So, in the house of David, you see this ginormous figure. And we're left wondering, is this actually how tall Goliath would have been? This is where I think it's really important that you and I differentiate between what is fact, what is speculative, and what is fiction. The size of Goliath, we're going to move from what we had that is factual into a little bit of what we have that is speculative. The only place in the Bible, in the biblical text, that we can find for a size of one of these Nephilim or Anakim is found of Goliath. Hey, Humble Theology fam. It's kind of wild, but I wrote my very first book and it released earlier this year. It's called The Hidden Peace. Here it is right here. Finding true security, strength, and confidence through humility. Really what I wanted to do was write a book that was accessible for the everyday average Bible reader, but gave you some sound biblical theology on the ancient virtue of humility, which was in fact the very virtue that sustained and helped the first century church to thrive and flourish. And this was all based around Philippians 2, 8, and 9, the idea that Jesus himself really exampled for us and modeled for us divine humility. And so the book is available right now. If you've ever felt anxious, if you are worried about what other people feel or look about you, I mean, if you've had any type of insecurities really at all in your life and it has robbed you of peace, the secret to the peace that you've been longing for is this ancient virtue that has for far too long been neglected, the virtue of humility. The Hidden Peace is available on Amazon and all the major book retailers where you would normally get it. You can also get a copy from Proverbs 31 Ministries, the P31 bookstore, which is where I serve as Director of Theology. And I'll have a link in the show notes for you as well. I pray that this book would be an encouragement for you as you grow and you learn how to cultivate the soil of humility, which is in fact the soil in which all the fruit of the Spirit of Galatians 5 flow from. Blessings to you, friends. So The Hebrew Bible, the Masoretic text, 1 Samuel 17:4, says that Goliath was 6 cubits and a span. So that would have been roughly 9 feet, 9 inches. This is massive. But what's interesting is the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found that actually date much earlier than what we have the Masoretic text. The Dead Sea Scrolls only has him at 4 cubits and a span, or roughly 6'9". Now, which is correct? The Hebrew Bible, the Masoretic text, or the Dead Sea Scrolls? The majority of the scholarship opts for the Dead Sea Scrolls reading, which would have made Goliath around 6'9". The tiebreaker for me personally on this is what the Septuagint says. The Hebrew Bible translated into Greek. The Septuagint gives the Dead Sea Scrolls the DSS size, which is the smaller size, 4 cubits and a span. So I want to read, there's actually a couple articles, scholarly articles that have been done to unpack this. One is by an Old Testament professor, Daniel Hayes, who's got an excellent article called Reconsidering the Height of Goliath, where he goes into primary resources. And then he's got kind of a rebuttal article to Clyde Billington on the height of Goliath. And so I want to read kind of just a section from this article, Reconsidering the Height of Goliath. And Hayes says this: the Hebrew Masoretic text reads 6 arm length cubits. The Septuagint reading also agrees with the Dead Sea Scrolls. The name of the scroll is 4Q SAM and Josephus. So there's now an additional piece of literature that affirms the smaller size. So following the Masoretic text, Goliath would have been 9'9". However, the Septuagint, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and Josephus make him 6'9". So because the weight of evidence is actually for the smaller reading of Goliath, I think that this is an area that the House of David exaggerates. It's speculative, and yet probably the better rendering for this is a bit shorter at 6'9". Now, some of you are very upset because I'm crashing all of your dreams and all of your memories of Vacation Bible School, where Goliath is this ginormous being, and you're like, wait a minute, are you trying to tell me that Goliath was 6'9"? That's like, they're NBA players that are taller than him, right? This is one of those challenges that you and I have as modern readers, trying to impose our modern situation and cultural context into the biblical text, right? So something that will actually be helpful for us is to retrieve the average size of an Israeli person around this time. There's a scholar named Victor Matthews, who's a scholar of Israelite culture, and he notes that the average height of an ancient Israelite during the patriarchal period was around 5 feet. Think about this. You're 5 foot and you get onto a battlefield and you see a dude that's 6'9". I mean, listen, if you were tall around this time, you might be 5'2" or 5'3". There is still a vast difference between a 5-footer and a 6'9", right? Some other really interesting things that in Egypt, we have some more archaeological digs that gets us into the bones of humans and kind of how big they were. It's hard with the Israelites because of the nature of where they were buried and just all the situations that were around it, that we just don't have as much evidence for it. That's not the case with Egypt. So the situation in Egypt, because of the embalming and all these other things, we kind of have a good idea of how tall the Egyptians were. So I'm going to read again another quote. The situation in Egypt among the elite who were embalmed were likely much more healthy because of their economic status. They were rich, right? And so the results in Egypt, but check this, is just slightly larger in frame. So they could have been between 5 feet and 5'5". Now, there's an interesting document where there have been evidences of some beings, that's the wrong word, some humans that were kind of massive. So one Egyptian text from the period of Ramses II, this is important because Ramses II was probably the pharaoh of Egypt in the time of the Exodus. So one Egyptian text from the period of Ramses II, described by Pritchard in a chapter entitled Problems of Asiatic Geography, specifically makes this point. This is what it says. The narrow valley is dangerous with the Bedouin, hidden under the brushes. Some of them are 4 or 5 cubits. This is about 7 to 9 feet from their nose to their heel, and fierce of face. Their hearts are not mild, and they do not listen to wheedling. Okay. Now that we've got all this, what do we do with the house of David? And the size of Goliath. My view is that this is a bit sensationalism. This is a bit kind of moving into speculation. the average height of these giants were probably between 6'9" and maybe 7'9". You know, there's a foot difference there. There's also another detail that's in the narrative that's really important. And this is found in 1 Samuel 16. What's very interesting is that Goliath, from a theological standpoint, the point of the narrative, I don't think the point of the narrative is to show the contrast between David and Goliath. I actually think Goliath is what's called a foil. Goliath is intended to help us to see the contrast between David and Saul. So remember Saul, right? Saul was a handsome dude, and he was tall. The text says that he was a foot taller than everybody else. He towered over other Israelites. Now think about that. If the average Israelite was 5 foot 5'3", and Saul towered over them, it's likely that Saul was a 6-footer himself, maybe 6'1", 6'2", right? Not only that, but in 1 Samuel 16, we find out in chapter 17, Saul has really good armor. And the armor was expensive, and the armor would have equipped him to be in a battle. Not only that, but Saul is the king of Israel. Who better? Like, this is why the Israelites asked for a king to rule over them, to fight on their behalf, right? Who better than King Saul to fight this giant Goliath? But notice what King Saul says to David. He panics for David. He says, David, you need to have my armor. You need to have my sword. Why? He doesn't say because of how big Goliath is. He doesn't talk about how high, how tall Goliath is. He says because Goliath is a fierce warrior. So the inclination here for me is that Saul is less concerned with how tall Goliath is. He's more concerned with the fact that the dude is super skilled in battle. Right? It's a both and, not an either or, in my opinion. Now, what's interesting about Saul is that Saul didn't have that military background. Apparently, he didn't have that war experience. But think about David. David's not tall. David is handsome, but there's like nothing really like recognizable about him. But what does David have that Saul doesn't have? David has experience. David spent his time in the flock, in the fields, taking care of the flocks of his father. It's an interesting correlation. David is introduced to us as a dutiful son in the field, taking care of the flocks. The first time we're introduced to Saul, he kind of is a bumbling kind of idiot. You know, he's like looking for a lost donkey for his father. And I think that's an intentional contrast for us. And so the reason Goliath is so important for us in this episode and in the episodes to come, as we deal with episode 1 and 2 and we get into that, is because Goliath presents to us two options of a Saul or a David response. Saul makes a bunch of decisions because of his fear of man. Right? It gets him to all kinds of trouble. And there's this iconic scene where Samuel comes to him and he holds him by his face and he holds him. He's like, why do you fear man when you should be fearing God? And I mean, that should give you chills in your heart, right? And here's David who's like, I'm not fearing, like I dealt with the lion, right? I dealt with all this stuff. Like, I'm not fearing that. I've got God on my side. So Goliath, you ain't nothing. And that is what the purpose of Goliath is. And the size of Goliath, it's actually to show us the contrast between a fear response versus a faith response. Okay. Now I know this is the big one everybody's been asking about. What in the world is happening with David's mother? Like, is David's mother actually a mistress of Jesse? Did Jesse have another wife beforehand? Like, what in the world is going on with David's mother? This is, remember I was talking about fact, speculation, and fiction. The Goliath thing is a combination of fact and speculation. David's mother's situation is a combination of speculation going clearly into fiction. Okay. So this is one of those things that I think that the House of David crew, they do a good job of getting us into like the story and making us feel for David and for the brother kind of tension. And I think that's important. Okay. So the show, The House of David, it really caused quite a stir with some very vague descriptions and honestly some scandalous presumptions of who David's mother was. Was David's mother a mistress of Jesse? Was she a second wife to Jesse, making her the stepmother of David and her other sons? And what's this situation with David's mom being a seer, like seeing visions from God? That's totally fictitious. So who is David's mother? This is one of those places where the House of David is incredibly fun, but just not factual. This is speculation. And I think they know that, right? David's mother, the goal of the show, I want to remind us, I don't think the goal of the show is insane biblical scholarship, but to portray a possible historically accurate situation. So the Bible is, for the most part, totally silent about David's mother. So it seems that the writers of the House of David picked up on some possible lines of trajectory to help point to what may have been the situation that left David in the fields and why there could have been some animosity between him and his brothers. So let me first make some connections with the biblical narrative. This is just stuff that for me popped up. These are my own connections. I haven't spoken to the writers of the House of David. I don't have any connection with them. This is just a theologian trying to respond and think theologically about this. This is some canonical connections. I don't presume to know that this was their intention, but I just think it's fascinating. There does seem to be a connection that's being made between Joseph and David. Joseph, think about Joseph. His mother's loved by Abram, and therefore when she dies, there's chaos and animosity between the brothers. Joseph is exiled and he's adopted by Pharaoh. David will eventually be adopted by King Saul, but he's never going to fit into the royal family, just like Joseph never fit in to Pharaoh's like a regime. When I say that he was adopted by Pharaoh, that's not a precise term. That Joseph is exiled and he rises to second in command of Pharaoh's household. In that context, the I think idea of adoption is fair, but he becomes part of the household of Pharaoh is what I'm trying to get at. David's eventually going to be adopted by Saul. Both of these guys, they don't fit in. Joseph leads the Israelites into safety from within Egypt, but David's going to lead the Israelites out of tribal insecurity from the Philistines. All right, all this. What about David's mother? Here's what we know. The Bible never names David's mother. Ruth was David's great-grandmother, and she was a Moabitess. David's sisters, this is an important detail. David's sisters are said to be daughters of Nahash in 2 Samuel 17:25. This is the speculation. This is the kind of little bit of biblical evidence that we can now potentially speculate out into what could have happened. So how could you have David's sisters who are explicitly said to be the daughters of Nahash? There are three possibilities. One, Nahash was another name for Jesse. Personally, I don't think this is convincing. Two, Nahash was their mother's name. This was David's name. I actually don't think that's very convincing myself. Number three, and I lean this way, very speculative. Nahash was another man wed to David's mother who died, and then David's mother marries Jesse. So that David's mother was a widow who marries Jesse. For me, it's this third option that seems the most likely, but it leaves us with all kinds of questions. Is the widow of Nahash David's mother? Or does she become David's mother, right? The House of David presents it as this is David's mother, which means that David and his sisters would have been the children of Jesse and Nahash's widow, but the other brothers had a different mom. Well, what happened to her? We don't know. Hey, Humble Theology fam, I'm so excited to share with you my first solo Bible study, Finding Peace Through Humility, a Bible study through the book of Judges. Now, the whole idea of the book of Judges is that the people of God are spiraling kind of out of control. And the question we have is it possible for them to actually come out of the spiral? And it is. And kind of what I present throughout this Bible study is that the thing that's hiding in plain sight, that God is just consistently trying to draw the people of Israel back then and his people today to, is the ancient virtue of humility. The gift of humility is the gift of self-awareness so that we can know who God is, we can know who we are, and so that we are powerfully equipped to know other people. And so I'm really excited about this Bible study. There are video lessons that go with it, and of course, this Bible study guide as well. You can get Finding Peace Through Humility on Amazon, wherever Bible studies are sold, and then I'll also put a link for it as well in the show notes. Blessings to you, friends. 1 Chronicles 2:13-16 says that David's father was Jesse, but the two daughters aren't connected to Jesse, just to David as his sisters. The alternative view is that David was the son of Nahash, and therefore Jesse is David's stepfather. I think that's totally bogus. That's not it. It's likely, and there's a quote from an article that suggests that. But for me, it's unlikely because David is explicitly mentioned as the son of Jesse in 1 Chronicles 2:13-16. So another option, and the most feasible one, is that Nahash's wife bore him Abigail and Zeruiah, but after his death, his widow marries Jesse and then has David with Jesse, which, still leaves all kinds of questions. This is where I just go, I don't know, you guys. A lot of different things could have happened. Another option is the two daughters are born to Nahash. Nahash dies. The widow marries Jesse, and to Jesse is born David. This would mean that David had a different mother than the other brothers, but all the sons are the sons of Jesse, and the two sisters are David's stepsisters through his mother. For me, this is probably the angle that is the most reasonable, but once again, rooted in all kinds of speculation. Another just couple things that I thought were interesting, and then I've got some questions that you guys have asked that I want to look at as well. But the other thing is, why is Samuel referred to as a seer? Like, what is this thing about him being a seer? Well, that word seer is honestly just a different word for prophet. And I just think that the House of David, one of the things that they're trying to do is they're trying to shake up our presumptions of what we already know. So when you have words that you become too familiar with, it's incredibly easy for you to just kind of jump past it and be like, oh, yeah, I already got this. I know exactly what's happening. And so I think by using an alternative word that's an appropriate word in my estimation, it actually causes, well, yeah, like what is happening, you know? Yeah, so I think that's an important kind of detail. Okay, let me go through some of your questions. This is a good one. Should I even watch this, or will it distort my perception of actual scripture? I think this takes wisdom. You know, one of the things I would recommend for everybody to do is, read the narrative yourself. Like, go through and read 1 Samuel, like 15 through, really the whole thing. Like, read the rise and fall of Saul, and the fall of Saul, and the rise of David, and even the fall of David. Know what the text actually says, so that when you're enjoying a TV show that is based off of the biblical text, but is not presuming to be explicitly, technically, exactly the exact same thing as it, you can be able to do kind of what I've just done, is like, okay, this is fact, this is speculation, this is just fiction. And so I would just suggest that you use wisdom with that. Yeah, this question, was David truly born out of wedlock? One of the reasons why people suggest this is because of Psalm 51, where David's like, I was born in iniquity, which might have been a suggestion that it was a sin of his mother. The grammar and the theology of that probably just doesn't fit. And so that is one of those things that even in scholarly circles is an extremely fringe idea. Yeah. Oh, the question of Goliath, and one of the things about his size is this question about Og of Bashan, this king who had this ginormous bed, right? And so one of the suggestions is, well, maybe they were 10 feet tall, because here's Og and he's got this ginormous bed. A couple things about that. That could be. That's why I kind of think, I think 6'9", and you can be anywhere from 6'9" to, 8 feet, The thing with Og and his bed, there's a literary technique that's actually being taken place, where the size of his bed is actually, I'm speaking off the top of my head, so forgive me if I butcher this a little bit, but basically from my memory, the size of the bed is kind of proportionate to the size of the bed of the god Marduk. And so there is this, intentional connection that's trying to show the two. Think about the temple, like the dimensions that are given of the temple of God, and what's happening inside the Ark of the Covenant, and all those types of things. There's this intentional way to actually point out the heavenlies. It's a description, it's a intentional measurement to point to something of cosmic reality. And so that is one of the things I think that's happening with the Og. Could he have been massive? Absolutely. Or could he have just been trying to let everybody know, hey, I'm the son of a deity? That's probably much more likely. Let's see. How do people know? Yeah, how do people know Samuel was the prophet from God, not just a crazy person? Part of it is just, does what Samuel say come to pass? Is he speaking God's words? Is there evidence of fruitfulness in Samuel's life? I mean, you kind of get to see it in House of David, where when he comes out and he kind of gives that massive, it's like that scene, and Saul grabs Samuel's robe, it tears, and he's like, just as my robe has been torn, so will the kingdom be torn from you, like that type of thing. And now there's this massive storm outside that takes place. I think there were probably visual things that took place, just like a burning bush, just like a cloud of glory, just like a pillar of fire that were presented to just let you know that, yeah, he was authorized. Yeah, and then just so many questions about David's mom. Y'all are like, what is going on with David's mom? So anyways, I hope this was helpful for you. We went through really, this kind of gives you a setup for episodes 1 and 2. We're going to work on episodes 3 and 4 in the next one. And hopefully that's going to be good in trying to continually to unravel what is fact in the house of David, what is fictitious but speculative. Sorry, what is fact, what is speculative, and then what is just fictitious, but honestly just kind of fun. So anyways, I hope you had fun with this. It was fun for me. I'm going to keep watching with my family. At the very end of this, maybe we'll do something kind of fun and do a big live stream or something about it. Appreciate y'all. Bye.